Retrofuturism is an aesthetic often described as a vision of the future from the past, and encapsulates many different styles and forms of media, including the focus of this video, retrofuturism within the Fallout universe. Retrofuturism essentially takes a look at the future and what the future could look like using the styles and the technology of the current era, which in Fallout is represented by our timeline's 1950s and 1960s style. Indeed, Fallout's retrofuturism can be seen widely throughout the world, incorporating a deeply ingrained 1950s nuclear atompunk style, contrasting the vintage shining colours of the optimistic 50s with the devastation of the wasteland. Fallout is based on a world that diverged from our own in a number of major ways following the Second World War, retaining the aesthetic of the American 1950s and 60s in our universe, but featuring a future filled with alternative technological advancements. Instead of the miniaturization of technology as in our timeline with transistors and microcomputers, the Fallout world instead did not prioritize reducing the size of technology and instead developed things like fusion reactors, advanced robotics, laser and plasma weaponry, and powerful suits of armor that can transform a single soldier into a more agile walking tank. Power armor. In effect, this meant that the aesthetics of the post-World War II society was retained with more advanced technology. And so looking at it from our perspective, we can see that the Fallout universe essentially looks like a futuristic version of the 1950s and the 1960s. Indeed, the world before the Great War of 2077 and the subsequent nuclear devastation was one home to hovering Mr. and Mrs. Handy housecleaning robots, cars based off the Motoroma tail-finned chrome concept vehicles of the 1950s, blaring out classic Frank Sinatra, but instead of petrol, they are powered by fusion cells. While there are many desktop computers similar to the ones that our world developed in the 1970s, they have primitive graphics and limited memory capabilities. The major computers of Fallout indeed, such as the Zax computers, still remain as giant complexes of machines using reel-to-reel tape storage and vacuum tubes instead of the transistor, which, while invented in 1947 in our world and was integral in developing microcomputers, was not invented in Fallout until 2067, just 10 years before the bombs fell. Instead, effort was diverted into further harnessing the atom, inventing compact nuclear fusion power generators and enhanced and miniaturized forms of nuclear fission, as well as more advanced robotics, cybernetics, and genetic engineering than we currently possess in our timeline. This meant that things like the aforementioned power armor and laser weaponry could be built, as well as a large number of these housekeeping robots and things like that used by many Americans before the Great War. Many such power sources continue to function hundreds of years after their construction as well. It's not just the technology of Fallout that reflects a retro-futuristic style though. Indeed, the clothing styles, the architecture, building interiors and furnishings, demonstrated perfectly, for example, by the workshop mode of the more recent Fallout titles, also remain heavily influenced by the culture of the American 1950s in our view, with popular styles such as Art Deco and indeed Futurism remaining prevalent in the Fallout universe and can be seen within the posters and the street signs as well. Radio, rather than the television, also remains the most common mass media, and food products are based on those popularised in the TV dinner era, such as boxed macaroni and cheese or canned meat and the Salisbury steak TV dinners and things like that. Radio stations mostly play mid-20th century American classics by artists such as the Ink Spots, Bing Crosby, or the Andrews Sisters, although this could be partially explained by the fact that most surviving songs are from the 40s and 50s, because very few pre-war recordings after this period are known to exist. Mid to late 20th century music and artists also exist or are otherwise referenced, such as Elvis Presley, Elton John, as well as, of course, Take Me Home, Country Roads. And obviously, I couldn't talk about Fallout's retrofuturism without delving a bit into its politics. Indeed, a highly hostile and somewhat paranoid view of communism, common to both worlds in the 1950s, remains a mainstay of the political scene of North America in Fallout, with anti-communist propaganda being widespread in American popular culture, and entities like the Brotherhood of Steel and the Enclave are violently anti-communist. A more direct example, of course, is Liberty Prime's iconic phrase in the Take It Back comics, screaming that death is a preferable alternative to communism. The overall politics of the pre-Great War United States also diverged drastically from our timeline though, perhaps most obviously represented by the American flag in the Fallout universe, which instead of the 50 stars, instead features 13 stars in a ring around one larger star, actually looking pretty close to both the Betsy Ross and the Cowpens flags during the early history of the United States. This is because in the alternative 1969 in the Fallout universe, the 50 states were consolidated into 13 commonwealths. However, the states themselves are believed to have retained some degree of their own sovereignty and political autonomy within each commonwealth. Also, in a divergence from our timeline, the Soviet Union is still a political entity in Fallout at the time of the Great War in 2077, instead of dissolving in 1991 like in our timeline. However, it seems that the USSR wasn't a huge threat to the US when the bombs fell, with them seeming to have an at least neutral status, albeit with a large degree of distrust. Rather, the People's Republic of China far eclipsed the Soviet Union's influence on the world, and it was instead China that was seen as the leader of international communism and the greatest threat to the United States. Indeed, in the late 1970s and early 1980s of our timeline, China experienced a loosening of the staunch rules of Mao and opened itself up to the world markets and to some degree of economic liberalization under Deng Xiaoping, as well as a rapprochement of relations with the United States. In Fallout, though, this seemingly never happened, with China instead remaining closely tied to the Maoist doctrine, but nevertheless became a major military and scientific competitor to America. Fallout overall sees far less cooperation and diplomacy between the rivals of the world, with each great power's technologies being a much more closely guarded secret, and thus the world of espionage and intense paranoia was far broader and more widespread. Indeed, the Enclave remains so staunchly anti-communist in part because of their belief that China had a much greater degree of influence and internal control over the US government than many thought, with the tendrils of communism seeping into the heart of Washington, D.C. In Fallout, the European Commonwealth is referred to as a single unified country. While in real life, of course, the European Union unifies many of the European countries, it largely handles economic concerns and trade relations between the member nations. Which countries are incorporated into the European Commonwealth is unknown, but some lore points to Western European nations like the UK, France, and Italy as definitely parts of the Commonwealth. The European Commonwealth invaded the Middle East as part of the resource wars in Fallout, hoping to seize their oil reserves, and the exact tempo of the war is unknown, but it ended in 2060 when Middle Eastern oil reserves ran dry, and the Commonwealth withdrew without anything left to fight over. The Commonwealth then immediately dissolved into what is referred to as the European Civil War that lasted until the Great War of 2077, and that is just a quick look at some of the politics of Fallout as well. So overall, the vision by the developers and implementing this retro-futuristic style into Fallout serves as a really interesting example of what people in our timeline in the 1950s and 60s thought the future would look like, but instead diverging down a far different path than our timeline. So let me know what you think about this in the comments down below. Do you like the retro-futuristic style? What do you think could be some improvements to it? Let me know, get your comments in below. While you're there, make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, but as always, thank you very much for watching.